Welcome to part one of this three-part series on how to write your speech of self-introduction. In this part one, I'm just going to give you a general overview of the speech of introduction, introduce you to the template, talk about its different parts, talk about what it is and what it is not. And then in part two, we'll go over how to create a central idea for your speech. So kind of like what's going to be the main point of the speech. And then in part three, we'll talk about what to do with the rest of the speech. So introductions, conclusions, and evidence. So part one. You're going to need two things to write this speech. You're going to need your course pack, specifically all the items that are in Module 2. And you're also going to need the Module 2 in Canvas, which is going to have all of the digital items that you need. And we're just going to kind of go right through. So first part is the assignment description of the speech. You're going to want to read through this. The assignment description has kind of all the basics of the speech of self-introduction. Its length, it's a 2-minute speech. It's going to be extemporaneous. That means that we deliver it from keyword cards that are based on an outline that we've prepared and edited in advance. And it needs to have a coherent theme or central idea with 2 to 3 pieces of concrete evidence that include an analogy and a narrative. And so that's the overview. And then as you can see, we're going to use the canons of rhetoric to evaluate it: invention, disposition, style, and delivery. Took memory out of this one because that's a more advanced topic. Invention is how good the idea is in the speech. So central idea is unique and remains clearly visible throughout. Evidence is quote unquote sort of relatable. We'll talk about that. And creative, and the speech takes a little bit of a risk. So that's all the stuff for invention. Disposition or organization uses the template: creative introduction, brief conclusion, full content, full sentence outlines. Style, in this case, the style is going to just be sort of enhances the content, which means we want vivid language, we want active sentences, and we want to write in a way that's conducive for speaking as opposed to writing for an essay. And delivery is going to be about eye contact, so more than half of the time maintains eye contact, minimizes physical distractions, playing with the hair, things like that. Speaks about 160 words a minute. That's about the rate of a speaker who is coherent to the audience. It's going to feel slower to you than you want. So right now I'm speaking probably 170 to 180. I could slow down a little bit. Of course, the difference between a live speech and what I'm doing right now is that you can pause, you can rewind. So I can go a little bit faster because you have a little bit more control over how you listen. In a live speech, of course, we don't have that ability. And we want to sort of, even if you're doing these as a video, we want to practice for live occasions. All right, so the first thing that's after that is there's a really cute little, unfortunately it's an essay, but I found it in an old Martha Stewart magazine, and I think that it demonstrates all of the principles of a really excellent speech of self-introduction. It's called Heart of Neatness by Nell Casey. I don't know who Nell Casey is. I assume that there's some kind of a travel writer. So there's a warm-up where Casey uses an analogy to compare how her house unraveled. I think it's a her. I actually don't know. How the author's house unraveled over the years as kind of a metaphor for the crumbling, like falling apart of her parents' marriage. And that's very deep and intense. You don't need to talk about your family falling apart as an introduction to your speech, right? But this is just one way that this author chooses to introduce the speech. And then the author finally gets to the central idea of the speech, and it comes right where it should, which is toward the end of the introduction, when the author says, "My formative years spent in an unkempt house with an emotionally messy family have led me to a hyper neatness, a gone too far impulse to fight childhood chaos." So instead of just saying, "Oh, I'm like a neat freak. My speech is about me being a neat freak," they take that adjective neat freak and they kind of nuance it and make it more complex. Because in this case, the hyper neatness that this person sort of identifies with is also a coping mechanism for how they managed with an emotionally messy family, right? It's not just that they're neat, it's that the neatness is an impulse to fight chaos. So then they'd use different pieces of evidence. They talk about the benefits, right? So they talk about the positives of the hyper neatness. So it says, many of my self-imposed chores are not extreme. I make the beds, I wrangle the sheets so that they're nice and tight. I put fresh flowers on the dining room table. These are the challenges and pleasures of keeping a house, right? So they use what we call enumeration or a list as a way to show you that their neatness is something that they enjoy. But then they talk about all the things that they don't enjoy about the neatness. They line up the television remotes. They push the books forward on the night table so that the edges line up like the squared shoulders of soldiers at attention. These acts do not make me happy. They keep me in a permanent hover around my house, continually preparing to live rather than actually doing it. So notice how, as the speech goes on and this person is talking about their hyper neatness, they keep adding more layers. So it's not just 2 minutes repeating themselves, I'm hyper neat, I'm hyper neat, I'm hyper neat, but they actually reflect on what that means, so that the more we listen to the speech, the more in depth it becomes. And then they talk about how when they go to a dinner party, they know what it's like. So this part I really like. I've been to other people's homes and watched with envy as they've let themselves fall into cozy disarray with accumulating guests, serving trays, and half full glasses. In those moments, I have a flash of what it must feel like for someone with an eating disorder to watch a friend guiltlessly devour a meal. I know it is a sign of vitality, and yet I cannot let go enough to do it too. So there's a nice analogy that gets included to talk about sort of like what this experience is like. Because again, if you're not a hyper neat person, or you are but you don't experience the same way that the author experiences the hyper neatness, they need you to feel what it's like to have this experience. And so analogies, lists, metaphors, these are all the ways that the author helps you process and grasp onto the central idea of them being hyper neat. And then there's this like nice little closing. That the author repeats the central idea. Somewhere along the line, neatness became an illusory form of control for me, a tight defense against the doom of a house, a family come undone. So very similar to the central idea that was at the beginning of the essay, but it's said in different words. A messy place, blah, blah, blah. And then they end with, what they don't do is they don't turn this into a motivational speech. So the speech remains about them the whole time. One of the biggest downsides to a speech of self-introduction is that a lot of times what happens, number one, we don't pick a theme or a central idea. So in this case, this person has a very clear, specific theme, hyper neatness. And they're exploring both the positives and the negatives of that theme, right? So they're not just saying, oh, I'm such a piece of shit, I'm hyper neat, and I'm always obsessed with details. Or and they're not saying like, I'm super organized, look at me, so organized, everything's always so put together. No, both of those would be terrible. But when you combine them, you have this nice complex, deep, sophisticated idea that looks at just a very straightforward aspect of this person's personality, but all the different ways it manifests itself, positive and negative. But what they don't do is they don't turn it around at the audience. So I always tell people, don't write the word you, Y-O-U, in a speech of self-introduction. Because when you write the word you, you're writing about the audience. You haven't earned the right yet to lecture the audience. You have to first prove that you can talk about yourself in a way that's inviting, engaging, and interesting, and then the audience will believe you the next time you want to give a motivational speech. But it's not time yet. You haven't earned your right. So it just wraps up the central idea by restating it, and then it ends with just sort of like a thoughtful closing statement. As always seems to be true, the balance lies between there is hope and cleanliness and happiness and mess, and allowing for both is the only way to make room for life, right? So there's a little bit of like a lesson at the end, but it's very subtle, and again, the speaker stays very close to their own personality. Now, there are downsides to this particular essay because it is written in essay format. So I wish that I had this in a speech, but I don't. I just happened to come across it years ago in an essay in a magazine, and I remember thinking, man, this is like the perfect self-introduction. So what I have done, though, is I have taken this speech of self-introduction, which I consider like textbook perfect, so a really great model of self-introduction, and I have created for you a template. So if we go over to the module, you will see that there is this assignment to submit your self-introduction outline draft to Google Drive. And in that, it asks you to find the template for the speech of self-introduction. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to open up the template. And what's happened is that I've taken the template, and I had created this template before I even read the Nell Casey essay, but the Nell Casey essay essentially follows the template. So that's how I know that this is a really fabulous template. I made it over years of experience, and for a lot of new public speakers, the hardest thing is just having a format. So I know you might feel constrained by the template, but I've never seen anybody write a really excellent speech of self-introduction that didn't in some ways follow this template. So you just kind of have to trust me that I know more about public speaking in this case than you do, and following the template is the best starting place for you. So let's look at all the parts of the template, and then I'm going to stop this video because now you kind of have a gist of the speech. You have an understanding that what we're looking for in the central idea is really a very clear, specific thing about you. Not 15 things, not 3 hobbies, not facts, not background, not history. The Nell Casey essay does talk about their childhood, but you don't have to. That's just a way that because they could talk about their hyper neatness without ever going into their childhood. That's just what they do. So you can do that too if that's something that's interesting to you, but it's not required. So here's the template. All right, the most important thing is this central idea statement, which is right here. It's one sentence. So if you look back at the Casey essay, I am hyper neat. It's an impulse to fight childhood chaos, right? That's the central idea. So they take an adjective about themselves like hyper neat, and they talk about the positive and the negative. And that's the central idea. It's one idea. It stays the same throughout the speech. And then we have a little warm-up. We'll talk about the supports. So when you do a warm-up, you're going to pick one of the supports. We'll talk about the supports in the second video. And the warm-up is not about the topic. So even though the central idea statement might be about you, you don't warm up talking about you. The central idea statement, if the theme is hyper neatness, you want to warm up talking about hyper neatness. You want to kind of get the audience on board with the theme. And then there's going to be an audience connection statement, and that's where you're just going to solidify that the audience has connected to the theme. Then you're going to attach it to you and talk about how you you're not going to, so we don't talk about ourselves here. So we never talk about the topic of the speech in the beginning. We only talk about the theme. So the introduction, which is 10% of your speech, so in a 3-minute speech, this should be about 30 seconds, no more. And the audience connection are all about getting the audience connected to the theme of the speech. It's not until the central idea statement that we introduce the topic. So in this case, I am hyper neat. Then you want 2 to 3 concrete pieces of evidence or supports, which we'll talk about in another video. And then a really short conclusion, 5% of speech. You're going to restate the central idea in new terms, just like Casey did. And then you're going to wrap up by providing psychological closure. And all that means is that whatever concrete specific warm-up you used, which is not about you, you're going to revisit it at the very end, which creates this nice sense of symmetry, like a circle closing on itself for the audience. Now, I've also provided you sample speeches. Sorry, I don't know why I got flubbed on that word. So I've provided them in different grade ranges. I've got some that got Fs. I would look at those because these two are kind of these C minus, D, F speeches. These are examples of speeches that are very gimmicky, and they sort of avoid talking about anything interesting, and they just kind of really use the cliches of public speaking. Then I've got these are out of order, but I have a C plus Sentinel for structure. Let me just rename that one because that's going to be confusing. Rename. So I'll say C plus B minus here. And again, the reason that they're sort of like, I'm not sure if they're a C plus or a B minus is because a lot of it depends on delivery. I always tell people really great delivery can't save a terrible speech, but really bad delivery can sink a really great speech. So delivery is kind of the factor here. So I always tell people, maybe start with the Sentinel for structure, which is sort of your C plus B minus, that's your passing speech, and start there and then move your way up. So Sentinel for structure. So we can see that this template was followed, and there's actually a video of this being delivered by Jeffrey, who was a non-traditional student I had at community college. And then here's Jeffrey's outline. So you can just look at this as a jumping off point. So first thing we want to look at is the central idea. So in this case, the central idea is I am, after 23 years in the military with regulations and step-by-step procedures, I'm a sentinel for structure, meaning I am like really obsessed with structure. So that's pretty good. It's not as complex as I'd like because it doesn't sort of allude to the benefits and the consequences, but there's a nice clear theme there, right? Sentinel for structure. And then the audience connection statement is where Jeffrey gets you on board with the theme. So in this case, now I'm telling you I'm offended. This lack of preparedness, this unprofessionalism rubs me the wrong way. It's unacceptable. Now notice what Jeffrey's doing wrong here is it's a lot of me, 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 me. Instead, there should be an audience connection, right? We all blah, blah, blah. So in this case, since it's all about structure, Jeffrey should probably do something like, you know, regardless of whether you're like a type A hyper neat freak or you just love chaos, all of us love some kind of structure. And for me, it's really important. I'm a sentinel for structure. So he kind of gets everybody to recognize that structure is important to them, but he just sort of makes it uniquely important to him. And then as a way to warm that up, he uses a very concrete anecdote about an event that he went to. It was supposed to start at 8:30. He gets there early to make sure that he's like ready to go because he wants to be prepared and he wants to be respectful. and then the presenter doesn't show up till 8:24, and then takes 45 minutes to find a power cord and how to operate the smart board and to apologize because they can't find the PowerPoint. So then, of course, the presentation doesn't even start till 9 o'clock. And so even if you're like the most laid back, cool person in the whole world, that shit's gonna piss you off because all of us like a little bit of structure. It's just that for Jeffrey, the structure is of the utmost importance. So great. So we got a short warm up. We have a little bit of an audience connection statement that needs a little bit of work. We have a central idea that's pretty clear. It just maybe needs a little bit more refinement. Then we talk about supports in the next video, and I will come back and talk about what Jeffrey did wrong and right in the supports. Now, Jeffrey's is a great place to start. It passed, right? With decent delivery, which he had very good delivery, which was fortunate for him, this speech could pass because it does all the right things. But if you also want to look at some other options, I've also included this B+, I would call it, speech from Viet with a video about how he's an emotional egalitarian. It's another way of saying like a people pleaser. And then I also have Marissa Filippello's speech here as well, which got an A-. And you'll see that there's a self-intro outline and there's a video. And once again, you can see the same exact structure, right? We have a clear self-introduction. I'm a high self-monitor. I work hard with other people, but I often overthink. So we got a little pro, little con, very nice, very clear, coherent theme. Little bit of an audience connection. We all struggle to put our best foot forward, especially in unfamiliar situations. But for Marissa, it's like especially difficult. So Marissa connects with you without just being the same as you, because you don't want to hear somebody tell you everything you're thinking. You want people to be unique, but also you want them to try to connect with you. And then there's a little warm up using that cliche, don't sweat the small stuff, right? But she sweats the small stuff, right? So it's like a rebuttal to a cliche. And then there's the central idea. And then we've got 3 supports: the analogy, the story, and then, actually only 2 supports. So Marissa just went with 2. You can do 2 or 3. If you do 2 really extensive pieces of evidence, you may not have time for 3. Some people do 3. And then a nice little closure, restates the thesis, and then a nice little closure. So yeah, I sweat the small stuff, but it's better to overthink than underthink. So she adds a nice little like twist at the end just to kind of wrap it all up. So this is a really great example of a speech of self-introduction outline, and you can watch the video that goes with it and look at Marissa's performance and her delivery and everything that she worked so hard on for that speech and how she uses note cards and makes eye contact. And Marissa's particularly animated. You don't have to be, I like to tell people, you want to be invested and you want to be emotionally available and you want to demonstrate that you've rehearsed and that you are present with the audience, but you don't need to be a drama queen. You don't need to be super emotional. There are lots of ways to demonstrate investment and energy and enthusiasm without kind of being like this over-the-top theatrical person. So don't confuse good delivery that's emotionally invested with like over-the-top excess, because you do not need to be like a theater kid to do a very competent speech. And if you want to see someone who just is a very chill, competent speech that's well-rehearsed and very poised, look at Jeffrey's speech, because his delivery really is top-notch and it's very different than Marissa's, and it might vibe with you a little bit better. So that's all for the introduction to the assignment. I'm now going to stop this video, and then we're going to have 2 more videos. One about how to create your central idea, how to find the best central idea for your speech of self-introduction. And then we're going to talk about what to put in the rest of the speech once your self-introduction central idea is in that part of the template. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.